What is up, guys? Adon here, back with another episode of the Mental Wealth Podcast, where we have real conversations with people who struggle, survive and thrive. Joining me today is the one and only Stuart Ralph. Stuart is the founder of the OCD Stories podcast, where he interviews some of the best minds in OCD recovery. We touch on his own battle with OCD, media misconceptions, and what it's like training to be an OCD therapist. I personally learned a lot from this episode. It's packed with great information, and Stuart is just a great guy. So yeah, let's get this going. Here's the third episode of the Mental Wealth Podcast with Stuart. Enjoy. Stuart, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, man. So just starting off, OCD is a big spectrum in itself, and many variant types. And what would OCD be in your own words?
Yeah, I think a year, 2 years ago, I would have answered that by explaining all the different variants of it. Now I'll start off a bit differently and say that actually there's only one type, and that's OCD. And I think we as sufferers and anyone who's kind of struggled with it experiences many different themes, whether that's like fear of being a paedophile or fear of harming someone, a family member. It could be getting thoughts of stabbing them, and obviously they don't want to do that, but these are the thoughts that come in. It could be fear of contamination, which is why the common one is the compulsion, seeing people washing their hands. Could be fear of just doing wrong, so when you're driving the car you get this intrusive thought that you've knocked someone over, and you keep driving back and forth down the road trying to look for evidence, which is obviously the compulsion. And these all seem like very different things, but actually it's all one thing. What I tell people is, people often come to me and say, do you know a good ROCD therapist, which stands for sort of relationship OCD? And I'm like, you don't need one of those. You just need an OCD therapist or a CBT therapist who can treat OCD. Because the more people stay in the content of OCD, which is the theme, the more stuck they get, because OCD's game is to keep you stuck in the thought, trying to figure it out, whether it's real or not, whether it's going to come true, whether you're going to die, whether you're going to hurt someone, etc. And the more you stay in that content, the kind of more lost you get. So what I try and the themes are useful because it helps people find one another and understand what's going on in their head online. But I think from a recovery point of view, people need to start seeing it as one thing, that it's just OCD. It's the almost inability to accept uncertainty in this one area of their life, and to live with the open question. Yeah,
I really like that. That's a great way to put it. Do you struggle with OCD yourself, or do you still struggle with it?
Yeah, so my earliest memory of it when I was about 7, and I don't know if it was a clear-cut OCD thought, but it was the first kind of intrusive thought. So I went to America, to Florida, to Disneyland, and I remember my dad was ill, so he had to stay the first night we got there, and he had to stay in the hotel room. And I was sitting, it was like a Denny's or a Wendy's or something like that, with my mum and my brother. And I just started getting very anxious. At the time, I didn't know it was anxiety, because most 7-year-olds don't know that emotion. But now in hindsight, I know it was. And I just kept getting the thought repeated over and over again that, the tarantulas killed my dad. And I could almost see the thought in my mind that this tarantula getting closer. And I was getting anxious because I felt like there was time to save him. And I had to tell my mum so we could go check on him. And I never said anything. I kind of just lived with that fear and that anxiety. And obviously the thought was that, we'd get back, he'd be dead, and I would be blamed because I could have saved him. And obviously we got back to the hotel room and he was absolutely fine. I think he just had a stomach bug. There was no tarantulas. And then similar thoughts with like sharks in the swimming pool. So I'd literally be in the swimming pool and I'd be overwhelmed with anxiety. I'd have to sprint out the other side. So I'd only be in the pool for literally 2 seconds, dive in, sprint out, get as far away from the side as I could. Because the irrational thought that these sharks in the swimming pool were going to kill me. And I can see why my brain went there, mainly through various films I saw. I mean, Jaws, but then there's the whole James Bond where the sharks actually come in the swimming pool through so I think as a 7-year-old, my brain kind of linked, oh, that's possible, even though really it's not. And then it kind of went on with more physical compulsions of walking back and forth past it was usually around old objects, old paintings, old ornaments. For some reason, that always triggered me. And it was if I didn't walk past it right, something just didn't feel right, and I'd get a real bad feeling, and I had to keep doing it back and forth until it felt right, in quotes, and I could go away and kind of be a kid. Or it could be sort of if I didn't count or tap in a certain number, some poor kid in Africa would die, or something bad would happen to my family. Again, this not quite right feeling was kind of how I describe it is it felt like if I didn't walk past it right, I would still have my life, but I wouldn't see my family in the same way as I did before. It was almost as if I was in like a different dimension, is the best way to say it. Like I'd be with them, but it would never feel the same. And then as I got older, it kind of went into sort of more harm, real event type worries, and relationship focused obsessions. So any kind of dating I was in, I'd end it very quickly. If I did manage to see them for a while, I'd just be swamped by anxiety the whole time, having sort of intrusive thoughts, whether it's right or not. So that's kind of my story. I mean, I originally went to seek treatment at 16 on the NHS here in the UK. Kind of got fobbed away because it wasn't, quote, serious enough. And they said, read these books. If that doesn't help, come back and we can do CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Obviously didn't read them because at that point I didn't read any books. I hated reading. I read all the time now, but back then I just hated it. And then I just continued kind of struggling for about another 10 years. It kind of went up and down, as sometimes OCD does for people. And eventually, when I was about 27, I just went privately and started getting better from there.
Can you see symptoms of OCD in other people then?
Yeah.
Even if they don't know themselves,
Funny enough, I was at a wedding this weekend just gone, and one of the bridesmaids was giving a speech about the bride, and she was talking about this time she was on. I don't want to give too many details away actually, but basically it was around vomit. And at first I thought, oh, that sounds like a metaphobia, the fear of being sick. But then I thought, actually no, what she's describing is not her worrying about being sick, which is a metaphobia, but it was about if she sees someone being sick near her, or someone tells her that someone was sick near them, she was basically making her flatmates wash all their clothes, really like scrubbing the floor where anything's been touched, which sounds very similar to contamination OCD. So, people were laughing at this story, and in my head I'm thinking, no, this isn't funny. Like, she sounds like she's at the early stages of something quite bad. And who knows, I'll keep an eye out. Maybe it will, if it gets worse, then I can intervene and say something. But yeah, I mean, when people talk, you can often pinpoint. It's, for me, what I always say to people around OCD is listen to what they're saying is the worry. That's the big tell for me, because sometimes compulsions are hard to notice, especially there's a term you may have heard called PURO, which stands for pure obsession or OCD. There's a lot of debate around it because there's no such thing as pure O. If there is such a thing as pure O, it's not OCD, because you need the compulsions for it to be OCD. But basically it's for people, let's say they get violent intrusive thoughts around, harming their loved ones, so that they end up moving all their knives. So that's a compulsion. Or they seek reassurance. That's a compulsion. But because it's not the more sort of checking doors, it's not washing hands, it's been termed pure O. So it's not a great term. But so for those people, it's hard to notice compulsions, but always kind of just find out what's going on in their head. What's the worry? What's the fear? And usually if it's very irrational, like if someone says, I'm really worried about harming a child, but you know that they absolutely adore children and have never done anything to harm them in the past, there's a good chance they're struggling with anxiety, not being a bad person hurting a child.
Yeah, so it's mostly centered around the anxiety, is it?
Yeah, so I mean, in America, so the DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's a mouthful, they declassified it as an anxiety disorder in the latest release, which to a lot of OCD specialists have hated that decision, because without the anxiety, the thoughts don't really bother people. For example, there was a study, I can't remember when it came out, but it showed that 95% of the population get intrusive thoughts. But the difference between them and some of OCD is the intrusive thoughts stick. largely they stick because the anxiety, kicks in. So, when I get intrusive thoughts around non-sort of OCD worries for me. And the reason why I say they're non-OCD is because there's no anxiety. So I can kind of push them aside and forget about them, which is what most normal people do. We've all had, especially in London, there's the underground. You stand on a platform or any train platform. Sometimes people get the image of just throwing themselves in front of it. Now, they're not suicidal. They're not, and they might be, oh, what was that for? And I get it all the time. Not every time on the train platform, I want to point out, but it doesn't make me anxious because deep down I know I don't want to kill myself. I have no intention of doing it, so I can push it aside. But if I started to get anxious, I would probably then put more emphasis on that thought and be like, oh, do I want to kill myself? And then that's when the kind of OCD cycle starts, and you're kind of trapped in a continuous loop.
So it's guilt, almost like an inner bully.
Absolutely. But it often gets termed the OCD bully or the doubting disease. And so the DSM declassified it as an anxiety disorder. And they weren't saying there's no anxiety. What they were saying is it almost needs its own thing because it's very unique to an extent to sort of generalize anxiety or social anxiety. But I personally think it should still be in the anxiety category. But at the end of the day, it probably doesn't make a huge difference.
Okay. Yeah, that is a pretty crazy decision. It sounds like it is centered around anxiety. Would there be any positive aspects then that you've found in OCD? Like from my own experience of struggling with like anxiety and depression, you could call it. I found that I have become extremely empathetic for others and their feelings and have you found something like that for OCD?
Yeah, it's interesting. They're similar to you. I think. Who was it I was speaking to the other day? I can't remember, but they work with many different people with different sort of diagnosable illnesses and even non-diagnosable. And what they notice is that suffering is the same. Like the symptoms are different. Maybe, I don't, but maybe I wash my hands and I worry about dying from catching some disease. Maybe you get really down on yourself and get really critical thoughts. And someone else hears like, or not obsessions, sort of in psychosis, hearing voices and stuff like that. Those are all very different things, but there's an underlying theme that runs through every single one of those, and that's that suffering. That's that sometimes feeling alone, feeling disconnected, maybe hopeless and helpless. I think growing up with that, as you said, made me hugely empathetic, which is why. Now I'm training into therapy because I want to be able to help others. And throughout my 20s, I always got a kick out of helping people, giving them hope, inspiring them. And I definitely feel that largely probably wouldn't have happened if I hadn't tasted some sort of pain or suffering. And I think we all as humans, whether we have a mental disorder or not, everyone suffers at some time in their life. And I feel being able to kind of, as you said, kind of learn that empathy is such a gift to the world. And I feel, so in a way, the other thing, so maybe this alliance, so Stephen Hayes, one of the founders of Acceptance Commitment Therapy, I was lucky enough to get him on my show on like the 4th episode. I just reached out to him thinking he's never going to do it, but he might as well, and he did. He did it. He gave me 2 hours of his time, which I was really, really flattered about. But he basically said near the end of that 2-hour chat, he said, look, if you've got a mental disorder, he said, you're the lucky ones. And that's a really weird thing to say, and it took me a while to kind of sink in. And what he meant was, he said most people are going to get to a point where they get past the mental diagnosis, the mental disorder, to a point where they can live a fairly stable life and it's not bothering them too much. In some cases, they've got rid of it completely. And he said, when you're there, he said the day-to-day stuff that upset most people, that ruin their lives because, they got a parking ticket like I did the other day, or so-and-so said something to them that upset them, it won't faze you. It will kind of go off you like a water off a duck's back because you're like, A, I've suffered through worse. B, actually, because life's better now, these small things, I'm not going to let them get to me. And that's what you're saying. You've been forced by having this thing to learn the skills to be mentally flexible or enact, they call it psychological flexibility. And the Joe public have never learned these skills, so they're very inflexible mentally. So anything can set them off. And yes, they're not going to be tormented to the point of like maybe suicide, as unfortunately some people with mental disorder, but they still get tortured. And it's that kind of slow, quiet, painful life they're going to live because they don't know these skills. And in a way, unwillingly, we've been forced to learn those skills. And I think that's a silver lining to it. When you start to get on the other side of recovery, you realize not that it was a blessing to go through that, but blessings can come out of it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah. It's funny how the lessons learned is so closely aligned with Stoicism as Absolutely. Well, Yeah. You had a great episode with therapists who uses Stoicism, don't you?
Yes. Donald Robertson. He's a Scottish guy who is he Scottish or Scottish? I shouldn't have said Scottish or Irish on your podcast. Yeah, it's a big insult. He's a Scottish guy and he now lives in Canada, but he started off as a CBT therapist and he lived in London for many years, and then he went to Nova Scotia, I think, and I don't know what he's doing out there. He's not actually doing therapy anymore, but he writes books on Stoicism, and he did one on the philosophy of CBT, which basically looks at how Stoicism underpins CBT. And was it Albert Ellis who created rational emotive behavior therapy, which arguably inspired Beck, who created cognitive behavioral therapy. So Ellis was hugely inspired by the Stoic philosophers, and Beck was also influenced by the Stoic philosophers. And you can see that in CBT. It's such a rational way of looking at your thoughts. And obviously that's in Stoicism.
Going back 2000, it's just crazy. It's crazy to see that it's still so effective today. Those kind of thoughts. So you mentioned that you were trained to be a therapist. So if you don't mind going into that a bit and like tell me the story of how that came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came out of uni doing media, then went on to do a master's in marketing because I thought, I need a master's to be able to get into marketing. I didn't in hindsight, but it did teach me a lot. So I then went into marketing and digital marketing specifically, which obviously helps me now with my own podcast. As you know, you're doing a course on it. So I was in there for about 8-year career in marketing, and I enjoyed it. And there's still lots I love about marketing, but it just didn't fill me day to day. As I said earlier in the show, I throughout my 20s, I loved inspiring people. I just got a real kick out of connecting with people and helping them in kind of their hour of need, I guess. And I started the podcast as well with no kind of hopes for it. I just wanted to interview people and hopefully help some people if they were willing to listen. And I think about 6 months in, I was like, I feel this is my path, my calling, if you want to say that. And I was like, okay, I need to start retraining. I was looking into it, and obviously I had no psychological background, so I needed to get some kind of underpinning. I didn't want to do another undergraduate because that's 3 years. So I went to Queen Mary in London and did a master's in mental health psychological therapies. So it wasn't hands-on, as in it was all academic, but it was a really good underpinning. And then I started in, when was it? September 2017 at the University of Sussex on a course called Low Intensity Psychological Interventions for Children and Young People.
Wow.
So I wanted to target children and young people to start with. And I think that's because, in a way, I wanted to heal myself, my younger self, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize at the time when I applied, but now, like, through therapy and stuff, I'm kind of linking it together. And I love, because I'm working with 16, 17-year-olds, and I love working with them. They're good fun, and it's a pivotal time for them. But yeah, so technically I can't call myself a therapist or training as a therapist, because in the way they do it in the UK, I have to do this course, then kind of work within the NHS for a year or two, get enough hours. I can then do the postgraduate diploma in CBT, and if I pass that, then I can call myself an accredited CBT therapist. So at the minute, I don't know what kind of a psychological intervention student, I think is the actual title. But in a way, I'm delivering treatment, but I just can't call myself a therapist.
Wow, it's a long road, but it'll be all worth it when you get there, obviously.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm enjoying the process. So
that's all you need, man. And do you often see any bad advice that's given out in the area of OCD treatment?
Good question. No, I don't often see, because I select like people who I trust to interview, so in a way it's always fairly good.
Yeah.
I'd say I see a lot of bad advice in forums, support forums for OCD. I wouldn't say bad advice. They're not saying necessarily to do various things, but what they do is they play into a lot of reassurance. They give a lot of reassurance. And for people with OCD or just anxiety generally, reassurance seeking is a compulsion. People with OCD would do it non-stop, but people with anxiety also do it to a lesser degree. You know, for example, it could be, do you think I really am that bad person? Or do you really think I did that thing? Or, you know, in the case of relationship OCD, do you really love me? All this type of stuff, and which sounds needy, but it's not. It's coming from a place of anxiety for those people. And in the groups, you often see people like, oh no, you're a wonderful person, and and obviously like, they're just trying to help. And this is why I avoid groups, because I guess I feel their pain. I don't trust myself not to be able to reassure them, so I avoid it altogether, because it is hard to hear people share their painful stories and not be able to reassure them.
Yeah.
So a lot of groups do that, which is quite bad. And support groups online anyway will often be very much about people, let's say, complaining about the real dark times, instead of the really successful groups for me are the ones that they can still share that, but then they twist it of, okay, well, what can I do now to help myself? What should I be doing? What should I be reading? Who should I be speaking to? The more kind of action orientated support groups. But some of them are, they can almost be a negative place. Not all of them. I don't want to do them as a service, but
yeah. I suppose it's a touchy subject when you're giving advice to someone with like a mental issue, because it's such a massive spectrum, and you don't know what, everyone is so individual, and it's just like trust in your own word, I suppose. You seem so confident in your word now. Like, was that always the case?
No, it's just been kind of through all the interviews and stuff and the time of doing it, I've just developed it and built it up. It's been a real learning curve. But I know, like, you know, who I am now. In a year's time, I'll look back and think, wow, you know, I said some stuff that was pretty shady that at the time I thought was fairly accurate. And that's just part of the learning curve. I'm sure everyone kind of goes through that. But it's just, sharing the best you can with the time you can. And the one thing I will do on the podcast, or if I speak to anyone, is always caveat it, say that this is just my opinion, unless it's really backed on research. And even then I say, look, it's only accurate to a point. Everyone's unique, and you've got to find what works for you. Don't take my word as gospel. Kind of take it with a pinch of salt and do your own research. Definitely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when it's say you're doing podcasts around mental health. You know, it's saying that you have to go elsewhere too. It's not really something you come to, as you said, for gospel word.
Absolutely.
So at what point did you decide to set up the podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast started in December 2015. I think December the 4th was the first episode I published. With a guy called Mark Freeman, who does a lot within the OCD community on YouTube. But he's also, I mean, anyone listening who has depression, anxiety, anything like that, even psychosis, like, listen to his stuff, because he's broadening out more now, and he has just a positive way of looking at mental health. Yeah, I can't promote him too much. So the first episode was with him. I've done a few since of him. But I actually started the OCDstories.com in August that year, because I was blogging before that about my own personal experiences in recovery. And then I thought, well, what's really helped me was reading other people's stories about OCD through various places online. And I thought, well, there needs to be one place that kind of brings all these stories together. But so I did that with the site, but it was also with a twist that they were recovery focused. So a lot of the stories were kind of, this is what's going on, this is how horrible it is, and that's kind of where it ended. And people have every right to kind of share that, but I wanted a site where people could come and they could hear how horrible it is, they could hear what went on, but actually now this is what I'm doing. Maybe they've only just started their recovery, but it's still that kind of now what? And that's what I want people to think about. You've got this thing, now what? Like, you can either stay in that place or we can do something about it. And that's that kind of stoicism again, and maybe a tough love message. But I feel it's an important one to share. So there, the stories are sometimes, the majority of the story is kind of people's story going through, kind of like I did at the start, about from 7 onwards, and then they're saying, usually towards the end, I started doing exposure response prevention therapy, CBT, taking medication, whatever it is, going to support groups. They read this book, so it's kind of sharing recovery paths basically in a story format. So that's kind of how it started. The actual written stories, I still publish them, but I don't kind of recruit them as much because it's quite timely for me to edit them, post them, etc. So the podcast is my main focus now, but people still love reading the stories, and I get lots of hits, kind of people reading those. But yeah, that's kind of then. And then I wanted to do the podcast just because I wanted to talk to really great people, and I personally loved. There was a couple of other OCD podcasts before me that had stopped at that point. I know one was still going, but it's stopped now. And they were slightly different. They weren't interviewing therapists, researchers. They were interviewing people with OCD, which I've started to do as well again now. Sort of once a month I'll interview someone with OCD. And then the other times it's all about getting the best information in the world and sharing it for free.
That is awesome, man. And like, you've had some incredible guests on, and what would be some of the top 2 or 3 gems of knowledge, if you could even pick that, just for the listeners?
So Stephen Hayes, who I mentioned earlier, who I think he was voted something like top 30 people in psychology of all time or something. I don't know if that's by the year they do it or they do it per decade or something, but anyway, he's a phenomenal guy. He's done like 500 studies or something ridiculous. He was just really great to talk to. And acceptance commitment therapy, and I'll talk about that because I think it can help people with OCD, but exposure response prevention is the gold standard for ERP and a lot of anxieties. But ACT, I think, is something that can help kind of most of your listeners, and it's something you don't necessarily need to go to a therapist for. Yes, it's good if you can, but there's not many of them in the world, unfortunately. But the book, The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris, that's a book based on acceptance and commitment therapy. And it gets you to start looking at your thoughts of, like, instead of you are the thought, whether that's in low mood and depression of not feeling good enough or what's the point, or in OCD, or whether it's an obsession about, am I going to die because I touched that door handle and it's contaminated by someone who's got AIDS or something like that. Instead of feeling, usually in those cases when it's so traumatic, people believe they are the thoughts. And what ACT starts to do is teach you that you're not your thoughts, you're having your thought. So in his book, Russ Harris's book, he gets you to say, speak to your brain. So almost say, thanks, brain. When your brain gives you that thought, it's a cognitive diffusion, starting to detach from the thoughts and see them as opposed to be them. So Stephen Hayes talked a lot about that, and all his work goes into that. Reed Wilson was a good one. He wrote a book called Stopping the Noise in Your Head, which is good for anyone with anxiety, but he also treats a lot of people with OCD. And he said, so what I was saying earlier about the theme being kind of don't stay there, and he said the content of your the content of your worry is trash. So again, this appeals to anyone with anxiety or anyone with worry. He said what you're worrying about is trash, it's rubbish, it's not important. It's the kind of psychological underpinning that you need to tackle, not the thing itself. I mean, there are caveats to that, like, you know, if there's a tiger in front of you and and you're worried, you know, the theme of your worry isn't trash, it's a real danger warning signal. But most people, even with just generalized anxiety and worry, a lot of their worries are just utter nonsense, and that it's not built on any foundation. You know, there's someone very close to me in my family who worries about everything. And you look at the worry, and it's always the worries to the extreme. It's very unlikely going to happen. It's somewhat based on truth, but it's just taken too far. And that's when you can say, in those cases as well, the worry, the content of the worry is trash. So his book, Stopping the Noise in Your Head, is really good. What else? From an OCD point of view, Dr. Stephen Phillipson, based in New York, he just gets OCD. He doesn't have it, but like he just gets it. It's those people, and you'll find this when you speak to people, when they just speak, they kind of just blow your mind of every sentence they say and they take. And he was one of those people for me. Then there's other ones with like Kimberly Quinlan, who's a therapist. She's an Australian, but she lives in Los Angeles. She's just really compassionate. So when I talked with her, the way she speaks about compassion and who she is as a person kind of just radiates, and that was really nice to pick up on that and feel that. And I feel doing each one of these episodes, I either learn something kind of cognitively, or I learn something emotionally. So with Kimberly, like I feel I've fine-tuned my own compassion for others and for myself by just chatting with her for a couple hours. So there's so many great guests, and I always hate naming them because there's so many I could list that
it's like picking a favorite child.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've checked out quite a few shows, and I'm always learning things from them. So what are your plans for the future of the podcast then?
So the future is keep growing it, reach more people. I originally had a goal of reaching 1 million people. I'm not far off it now, which is really
awesome.
Amazing. Well, I say 1 million people, it's nowhere near that. It's 1 million downloads I'm nearly reaching, but I'll take it. But I never expected it to do well. I hoped it would, but I never expected it to. I'm at the point now where I kind of have to turn it into a business because it takes up so much time and it's very demanding. And obviously then if I'm doing that all my evenings and weekends, it's unfair to my wife. And if we have a kid in the not too distant future, I need to be there for them. So it has to get to a point now where it can, I can spend some of the weekdays on it. So I'm doing more through kind of Patreon, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, definitely.
Occasionally do sponsorship and stuff, but so that's the goal really. The main goal is just to reach more people because I believe in the product still, which is the hour-long chats and the hopefully the value people will get from that. So it's more just that hasn't changed. It's more just the business side. So if I ace that, the core mission becomes a lot easier and I can reach, 10 million hopefully because I have the time to amplify it. So that's the goal, is just spreading good information. And I guess a secondary goal for me is just breaking down stigma. People generally don't get what OCD is. And I probably should have said that at the start. The media.
Go back into it if you want, yeah.
Yeah, cool. The media, latch on to for some reason, and I'd love to do a history, kind of look back at the touch points of in TV and film when this happened, but they see OCD as a different diagnosis, which is OCPD, which is so we're saying OCD technically is an anxiety disorder. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is a personality disorder, and that's basically where people are very what's the word? More neat, more, I don't want to use the word anal, but they're very rigid in colors have to match. And I'm probably doing them a disservice now, so I apologize to anyone who has it. Everything has to be in order. And the big difference is, because sometimes that can be the case for people with OCD, but the big difference is, and this is why I always said earlier to go back to the thought, what's the thought here, what's the worry, is people with OCD, their thoughts are what they call ego dystonic, and people with OCPD, usually their thoughts are ego syntonic, which so basically means they're neutral towards their thoughts, or maybe they even like their thoughts, like they like being ordered and neat. For some people with OCPD, it's still torture for them. They don't want to have to do that because it's too much. With OCD, their thoughts are ego dystonic, which means they don't want the thoughts. So, for example, when I was having relationship worries, I didn't want to be obsessing about whether I was in the right relationship. I loved my now wife, then girlfriend, and I was getting these thoughts that maybe I'm not in the right relationship, and that was kind of torturous to me. And again, when I've had thoughts of some poor kid in Africa dying as a child because I didn't tap the banister 3 times or something, I didn't want that to happen, and that's where it becomes torturous for someone with OCD. And because it's torturous, they then do the compulsions to nullify and reduce that thing from happening. So that's kind of the big difference is, someone with OCD hates their thoughts, and that's what drives that compulsive behavior to reduce the likelihood of it happening. Yeah.
Do you think that's thrown around, like depression, anxiety, OCD? It's thrown around way too much in the media, almost for clickbait, to make it relate to everyone, And they're like, oh, I might have this, and it's kind of discounts people who are really suffering.
Absolutely. Like the term, a big one in the OCD community, and I don't get involved with it too much because I spent a lot of my 20s being a real kind of, what's the word? I don't know, like moral warrior, like just for trying to fight everyone's corner. Yeah, you're nodding, so you get it.
Yep.
And it's so, being that person, although we need those people in this world, it's very toxic. And I couldn't handle the negativity all the time, like trying to fight the government because they were spying on us when they didn't really have the right to do so. I've been to all those marches and stuff before, and it just gets very negative. So I try and stay out around this debate, but I think through the work I'm doing, I'm indirectly helping it anyway. But the whole, you can just go on Twitter and type something like I'm so OCD or so OCD, and people will take a picture of their high heels lined up and just say, oh, I'm so OCD, and that's, if anything, that's OCPD, and that's doing people with OCPD a disservice, because just because you need your shoes doesn't necessarily mean that you're struggling with it. And if you're joking about it, you probably don't have something. And people in the OCD community absolutely hate that term, and rightly so, because it further pushes away the truth of what OCD is. And it's something like there's many different studies, but it's 8 to 12 years it takes for someone from the first OCD symptom to get treatment. And I look for me, and I was about 10 years before I went to speak to someone, and then even further until I actually got treatment. But, if the media are putting out actual representations of what OCD is, people will see that and be like, oh shit, I think that's what I have, and they go to their GP and they say this, and hopefully that would be the first step into getting treatment. But because they hear the word OCD and it's paired with I think it was Monk, the detective show, as a kid, they said he had OCD, but it was more kind of OCPD type symptoms, I believe. And you see stuff like that, and then you think, well, I don't have OCD because I'm not doing that. I'm just worrying about whether I ran someone over earlier and driving back and forth down a road. But until you see that on TV, they're not going to think they have OCD, and that's why it stops people getting treatment. Like there's obsessive compulsive cleaners on Channel 4 here in the UK. And that's not, so that could be OCD in the sense of if they were having fears, they were cleaning because of contamination, let's say, then yeah, absolutely, that's probably OCD. But they're not, they're cleaning because they love cleaning, like they love the cleanliness of it. They're not doing it to get away from a fear. And I know Ashley Forward, the CEO of OCD UK, has contacted them many times to the Channel 4 asking them to stop. And every time they've kind of said no. And they've kept the show going, even though it's causing harm. I don't know the full relationship of it, but that's from what I hear. And I believe he's published his emails to them on the OCDUK.org or .com, I can't remember. I think it's .org. And that's not, that's just one example. It's happened many, many times with many different TV shows. Khloe Kardashian has got, I can't remember the Khloe OCD, I think she's called it, which I think is like a range of products now, but it's also a hashtag, and it's pictures of her like putting different coloured things in jars and it sounds like, she does have some issue, but it sounds more like OCPD. But obviously, she's, so young girls and, girls in their 20s will see Khloe Kardashian. They love her. They, follow her every word and buy all her products. So then if someone were to go, no, that's not OCD, they're going to defend Khloe because Khloe's a celebrity. So people see that as an expert, that they somewhat know what they're talking about, even though she doesn't. Or if she does, she's evil. But I doubt she knows. Although I'm sure the amount of backlash she's got now, I'm sure she's very aware what OCD is. That is the thing about the OCD community. They will, I say, attack. They will defend the term to the death.
Rightly so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with depression and anxiety, I think it's often seen as a bit of a joke. Like OCD is absolutely seen as a joke, unfortunately. But I think mental health generally and anxiety and depression can be seen as a bit more trivialized, which isn't good. I mean, depression's quite good in the sense there's more and more people, celebrities coming out and saying, I struggle with depression, or I did struggle with it, and this is how severe it got. And I think that's great. There's not enough celebrities in OCD coming out and saying that, unfortunately. And I think that's a big one. The more celebrities or people in power that come out and are honest with what they've struggled with, is going to help all the different diagnoses. But it's that whole stigma again. If I come out and say this, do I look weak? Do I look vulnerable? Are people going to judge me? Are people going to think I'm insane? And that, especially in OCD, the fear of kind of being insane. I mean, I had that as a kid, and it stopped me from ever speaking to my parents. And I know people get fear of being judged by their colleagues or work. I'm kind of in a position now. If someone asks me, I'll openly tell them, I'll share my story, because keeping quiet helps no one. Doesn't help myself. It doesn't help anyone else. The amount of times I've told people and then they've said, I don't have that, but I get really down at times. And then they open up about, well, they're struggling. And that could be, a first step to them kind of seeking treatment, or, just inspiring them to read a book that helps them, give them some more mental skills. And it's not like everyone doesn't have to share the story if they don't want, because I appreciate, everyone's different. For me, though, I just felt I needed to. And I feel the more people that do, the less taboo it is. And I think, in 100 years, we could get to a point where someone could come out and say, hey, I'm having these thoughts about stabbing someone. I really hate these thoughts and they're scaring me. And the people go, oh, that sounds like you're struggling with anxiety and maybe OCD. And there's no judgment. They're just like, you should go to speak to a GP. It's like if you said to me, oh, yeah, I broke my leg, I'll be like, oh, okay. I hope you feel better soon. And I hope that's where we get to with mental illness. It's like, oh, so you're down right now. Well, that's okay. Just, go speak to your GP. And so you see what I'm saying? So there's no shock, there's no awe. And I think we will get to there. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, how can us young adults, how can we work to decrease that stigma around OCD and increase the awareness around OCD, and so that people can get diagnosed faster?
Yeah, I think it's if you have it and you're in a position where you're a bit more stable now. I say stable because I don't want people who are like really, really in the depths of it start blurting out their story. Because maybe that might help you, because that's one way of kicking OCD in the face, because you're kind of saying I'm going to live with the fear. But I don't necessarily recommend it, or someone with depression or anything. But if you feel you're in a better position in life and you feel that opening up could help someone, even if it's like you don't necessarily put it on social media, but you see that you think someone's struggling and maybe you just have a word with them and say, hey, I struggle too. And it's up to you how much detail you go in. But so whether it's on a one-to-one basis or whether it's doing a podcast and telling the whole world, I think the whole just speaking up and talking about it, it's the whole maybe not the best comparison, but with what's gone on in Hollywood, where all these women have been abused, and actually young children as well in Hollywood, young actors are coming out and saying it, and it was kept quiet for so many years because of shame, because of fear that they were going to get thrown out of the industry or whatever. And I'm not criticizing them, because if I was in their position, I probably would have done the same. In fact, I did do it with my own kind of mental health. I kept quiet about it. So the perpetrator, in this case, it wasn't a sex pest. It was my own brain, OCD, kept me captive because I didn't speak up. But when you're kind of on the other side and it's easier said than done, just kind of speaking up, it shines the light. And when that light shone, it's hard for OCD to hide. It's hard for these sex pests to hide in Hollywood.
Yeah.
People are going to think twice now before they do anything in Hollywood again.
Yep.
And the more we speak up around mental health, it's hard for depression to hide. It's hard for OCD to hide.
That's a great comparison. Yeah, that's beautiful, man. I actually have 2 questions from Reddit OCD, if you're okay with answering those.
Yeah.
So what are some alternative treatments to consider if CBT doesn't work? And that's from Subzibub.
Okay, cool. Oh yeah, Subzibub. Is that right? I mean, first I'd want to know their definition of CBT, and the reason I say that is because sometimes, Stephen Phillips had said it best. He said, "I wish people would stop treating OCD with cognitive therapy and start treating it with behavior therapy." So obviously CBT is made up of the cognitive piece and the behavioral piece, and a good therapist will often merge the two and use both to treat someone with OCD. But if you had to absolutely only pick one of those two, if the therapist said, no, I'm only going to do one or the other, which they wouldn't necessarily ever say, always behavior therapy. With a lot of anxieties, but with OCD especially, exposure and response prevention therapy, which is a part of CBT, is the gold standard. It's been proven time and time and again in clinical trials to be effective. And I asked Dr. Jonathan Abramovitz. I can never say his surname. I butcher on every episode I speak about him. Anyway, he's done I think he's done like 250 studies in OCD. He's one of the greatest pioneers in it. Where we are today is largely because of him and a few others. And I asked him, I said, look, if ERP is so effective, it begs the question, is there such a thing as treatment-resistant OCD? And he said no. I don't think that was necessarily a hard no, but he said it's unlikely. Like, he said often it's the therapist isn't doing it right, hasn't tailored it enough, is going too quick or too slow, whatever. There could be a million ways. So sometimes it's about finding the right therapist, the right expert, and sadly they're not as widespread yet as we'd hope, but there are more and more doing therapy over Skype, so it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can do that. So there's many factors of why ERP, if it's not working for you, why is that? Is there something else blocking it? Sometimes it can be depression gets in the way. So with OCD, they often say treat the depression before the OCD. Because if you're really down on yourself and unmotivated, you're not going to want to face your fears. So treat the depression first. But let's say, you've been to 5 of the world's best therapists for ERP and OCD, which I don't think there's anyone who's ever done that. But let's say, one thing I will say is acceptance commitment therapy. You can look at that. There's some early trials in the effectiveness of it for treating OCD. As part of my master's, my dissertation was a systematic review compiling all of the studies. And the research looks very positive, like it can be very good for helping OCD. But the trials they're not often randomized controlled trials. They're not on large samples of people, whereas ERP has that evidence base. So I would never push someone down that avenue before ERP and before trialing ERP. And sometimes you might have to do 3 courses of ERP and absolutely get a therapist who fully gets OCD. So that's my best advice, is just find a therapist who really gets OCD and who's great at ERP. And then just do some reading as well. Really understanding why ERP works is important. And also you could do some reading like The Happiness Trap, which will give you some sort of ACT principles to implement. And the other thing is medication isn't necessarily crucial for OCD, but it can help. And there's no research showing this now, but I'm not going to make a prediction. I wouldn't be surprised, let's say that, if in 50 years we work out there's 2 types of OCD, which is one is a more biological chemical imbalance type one, and one is a more learned behavior. And the reason I say that is because medication only works for about, it says 40 to 60% of people, but let's say it's 50% of people. And even then, it's not always like that great. It only helps slightly. But for some people that have OCD and take medication, it like stops the thoughts completely, which to me baffles me why that's the case, and why, if it was one part of the brain it was happening, surely it should help everyone. because obviously it's a bit more effective for depression medication, but with OCD it's very kind of like either works or it doesn't, which to me signals maybe it is more chemical for some people and more learned for others. But no one quote me on that. That's just a guess. Yeah.
Some great advice there, man. Yeah, that train of thought as well. It does make sense. But again, won't quote you on it just yet. But yeah, it does make sense.
Just remember this in 50 years.
And Sin of the Soul asks, what resources helped you with coping with OCD other than medication and or therapy?
Yeah. Okay. What was the name? Sin of Soul.
Sin of the Soul.
Sin of the Soul. Good question. Well, obviously, I didn't take medication. I'll be openly honest. Not because I felt I was better than it or I was against it. I just didn't feel at that time. I don't know. I'm not saying I didn't need it, but for me, medication. Some people can be on it for a lifetime, and that's okay if they feel they need it. But what was his name? He wrote Brain Lock. Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, neuroscientist. He used to research a lot into OCD. He doesn't research OCD anymore. He's changed interests, but he basically, in the case of OCD, said about medication that it's almost like armbands or water wings, as people in America would say, that they allow you to stay afloat long enough to do the therapy, and it's the therapy that helps you get better. But without the medication, some people wouldn't be able to do the therapy because so much is going on in their head, they wouldn't be able to focus. But like I mentioned, some people could be on it for a lifetime, and that's okay. But yeah, for me, I felt I was in a position where I could do treatment without the medication. But yeah, therapy, I just read so many books. I didn't read every book on OCD, but I read as many as I could digest in the time frame I was recovering. Knowledge really helped me. These books are written by experts, some of the best in the world. So you get the understanding of what's going on in your head, and I think that's huge for OCD and just any kind of disorder. But also they give you tools, they give you exercises you can do. It's kind of like looking at recovery is kind of like training for a sport. You can go to I play basketball, so I can go to training, I can do the 2 hours training with the team, and then I can do nothing all week until game time. Or I can come home and I can shoot more shots by myself. I can read a book on basketball plays. I can go for a run. I can lift weights. And that's clearly, hopefully everyone can see that if I just did the first versus the latter, who would be the better basketball player out of the two? And it's the same in recovery. You make recovery the most important thing in your life. And as part of that recovery, you've got to do the things you enjoy, because especially in anxiety and obviously in depression, you stop doing the things you enjoy. You're not motivated, or you're scared of doing it in case of anxiety. And we know behavioral activation is one treatment for depression, where you just get people to start doing things again. And you don't have to start big, you start small, but it makes a difference. I notice, I have had depression, but not like, I don't say clinical depression because it was never really, really crippling for me. But I've really, let's say low mood. I've really struggled with low mood in the past, and I still get it. And I noticed that on the weekend, if I lay in too much and don't get up and do anything, I hate my life. I'm really unhappy.
Yep.
If I manage to get up and go for a walk, and being in nature is huge for me, going for a walk or run or playing basketball or just going to see a friend or even working on a podcast, I'm happy for the rest of the day. It's weird. That one change made a huge difference. So that's a big one. People forget that in recovery. For me, it's a huge part. Living the life you want to live in spite of OCD, depression, psychosis, whatever it is a huge kind of middle finger up to whatever you're going through, because you're saying it's just an emotion, it's just a thought, and I'm going to live my life in spite of all this. And maybe that's a stoic thing again, but it's a powerful thing. And what you're showing, especially in the case of OCD, you're showing your brain, it really doesn't matter what's going on because I can still live my life. And often people will say, oh, I can't do X, Y, and Z until I get rid of OCD. The correct way is saying, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z until I get rid of OCD, because that is one way of getting rid of it. And that's a huge part of recovery for me. Yeah, like I said a minute ago, being in nature is massive for me. I love going for walks. It doesn't have to be the great outdoors. It could just be a little park with some trees, but like being around water as well, so like lakes and stuff, really helps me. Meditation helped me. I know it doesn't seem to help everyone, and especially if you've got a lot of thoughts going on in your head, be it critical thoughts or sort of obsessions, it can be really hard to focus. But things like mindfulness can be a good bridge into meditation. But I try and meditate daily, and there's a clear difference in my well-being when I meditate daily versus when I don't.
Definitely.
I know it's like, I get caught in my thoughts. Do you meditate at all?
Yeah. Every day.
Awesome. Yeah, good for you, man. It's a skill, and it's not. Yeah, I'm sure you found this. Like when you first start, it's not easy, but eventually it gets easier. And
still isn't easy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go on.
Yeah. And surrounding yourself with the right people.
Oh, that's huge. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So like surrounding yourself, as I know you do in Galway, through various people doing great things in sort of business and startups. So it could be that. So whatever your passion and interest is, sin of the soul, if you love cricket, go hang out with loads of people who love cricket, and being around those people talking about the passion, the things you enjoy, will get you excited, will take your mind off whatever you're struggling with. But it's also getting around recovery focused people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the thing you have, in this case OCD. It could be just people who have depression, but they're really like kind of that champion spirit of life really sucks right now, but I'm going to find a way. And when you're around those people, was it the average of the 5 people you spend your most time with? So if I want to be a really peaceful, calm person, if I hanged around 5 Buddhist monks for a year, no doubt I'd be a lot more at peace in my head there in a year than I am now. But if I hang around 5 people who are like smoking crack, in a year's time, I'm probably going to be smoking crack. It is really that simple.
It really is, man. It really is. I'm really cognizant of your time right now, man. So I think it would be a good place to wrap it up. Thanks a million for everything that you do. You're changing the world one spark at a time. It's really cool seeing the feedback you get from people as well. I'm sure that's amazing.
Yeah, it feels good. And, I appreciate you giving me this opportunity. And, I also appreciate what you're doing in the mental health world. And I know you're going to make a positive dent. So keep it up.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate that. And where can people find you?
Just head over to theocdstories.com. And you'll see the stories, you'll see the podcasts. If you listen to podcasts, which obviously you do because you're listening to this, on like iTunes or any of the Android apps, just type the OCD Stories.
And that does it for this episode of the Mental Wealth Podcast. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to listen. You'll find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes over on our website at mentalwealth.blog. You'll find links to our social media on our website too, and if you have feedback on the shows or for guests that you'd like to hear on, I'd love to hear from you. And that's about it. Until next time.